The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes after a long night of rain. The air smelled clean, and the sun peeked through the thin clouds, lighting up the small street where he lived. His house stood at the corner, neat and simple, with a little porch and a faded wooden fence that his dog loved to lean against whenever someone walked by. It wasn't a big house, but it was peaceful, and that was all he ever wanted. Every day started the same way. He would wake up early, before the town was fully alive, and prepare his coffee. The sound of the coffee machine and the soft hum of the ceiling fan were the only noises in the room. His dog would come running in, tail wagging, eyes bright with excitement, ready for their morning walk. That dog wasn't just a pet. It was his best friend, his shadow, and his comfort after years of silence and distance. He had lived in that town for a few years now. Most of the people there didn't know much about him. They only saw a quiet man who kept to himself, who didn't talk much but always nodded politely when someone greeted him. He never spoke about his past, never mentioned the years he spent serving the country in ways few could imagine. To him, those memories were locked away, buried under layers of discipline and pain. The world only saw an ordinary man with a well-trained dog living a quiet life. He had chosen this place because it was calm. After a lifetime of chaos and uncertainty, all he wanted was to feel normal again, to buy groceries without scanning exits, to walk his dog without expecting danger, to sleep without the sound of helicopters echoing in his dreams. The small community seemed like a good fit. People minded their own business. Children played on the sidewalks, and the local store owner always greeted him with a friendly smile. His dog was a strong, loyal companion. He had trained it himself with patience and love. The dog followed commands perfectly, but also knew when to act on instinct. It had once been trained for serious tasks, but now its job was simple: to keep him company, to bring him peace. They were a perfect pair, a man who had seen too much of war and a dog who had learned what loyalty truly meant. On that particular morning, the man tied the leash, opened the gate, and stepped onto the street. The ground was damp and the smell of wet earth filled the air. He walked slowly, taking in the view of the trees along the path. His dog trotted beside him, occasionally looking up as if to make sure everything was fine. It was their ritual. Same time, same route, same peaceful silence. People in the neighborhood were used to seeing them. Some waved. A few smiled. But most just watched with quiet respect, sensing there was more to him than what appeared on the surface. There was something about the way he moved. Calm, controlled, alert but never tense. Years of training don't leave easily. Even when he was walking his dog, his mind was sharp, aware of every sound, every shadow, every car that passed. He didn't want attention. He didn't want questions. He just wanted peace. As he passed the park, a jogger appeared on the other side of the path. The man nodded politely and continued walking. The dog barked once, not aggressively but in a playful, curious way. It was a bark that said, "I see you," not, "I'm coming for you." But the jogger froze for a second, startled. Maybe the bark was louder than expected, or maybe fear took over too quickly. The jogger frowned, then shook his head and kept running. The man didn't think much of it. He gently tapped the dog's head and whispered a quiet command. The dog immediately calmed down, tail wagging again. They kept walking toward the far end of the park, where the sun was rising higher, and the birds were starting to sing. It was a good morning. When they returned home, the man gave the dog breakfast and sat down to read. His small living room was filled with reminders of a past life. Medals tucked away in a box, old photos hidden in drawers, and a folded flag on a shelf. He never displayed them openly. He didn't need the world to know what he'd done. The pride he carried wasn't about recognition. It was about doing what was right, even when nobody was watching. Sometimes at night the memories came back. He would sit on the porch with his dog resting beside him and stare into the distance, remembering faces and moments he could never forget. But the dog always seemed to sense when those thoughts arrived. It would nudge his hand gently, pulling him back to the present, reminding him that he was home, safe, and not in those places anymore. Life went on quietly. He helped his elderly neighbor fix her fence. He volunteered to mow lawns for people who couldn't. He didn't speak much, but his actions spoke plenty. Everyone liked him, even if they didn't really know who he was. And he liked it that way. But peace, as he had learned many times before, is fragile. It takes years to build, but only seconds to break. That breaking point began with something small, just one misunderstanding. It happened on a bright afternoon a few weeks later. The man and his dog were once again at the park. Kids were playing soccer nearby and families were having picnics. He stayed on the far side, away from the noise as he always did. The dog was off the leash for a few minutes, running in circles, burning off energy. It was obedient, trained to come back at a single word. A young boy's ball rolled near them. The dog ran to fetch it, thinking it was a game. The boy laughed, not scared at all, but the boy's father saw the large dog running and panicked. The man immediately called the dog back, and it returned within seconds, sitting obediently by his side. But by then the father had already pulled out his phone. The man didn't think much of it. He patted his dog's head and decided it was time to go home. He had no idea that a dangerous animal complaint had just been made. A short while later, 2 patrol cars rolled into the park. The officers got out, scanning the area. One of them spoke to a few people, pointing toward the man and his dog. The man saw them approach but stayed calm. He wasn't worried. He hadn't done anything wrong. His dog was calm too, sitting beside him, waiting for a command. The officers asked a few questions, their tone already serious. The man explained softly what had happened, that the dog had simply chased a ball, that it was well trained, that no harm had been done. But one of the officers didn't seem convinced. His hand rested near his holster as he kept glancing at the dog. The man noticed the tension. He had seen it before, that look in people's eyes when fear overpowered reason. He tried to ease it. He told them the dog was friendly, trained, obedient. He even had its certification tags on its collar. But one wrong movement can change everything. The dog sensed the officer's unease and stood up slowly, not growling or barking, just alert. The man placed a hand on its head, whispering something only the dog could hear. It sat back down, calm as ever, but the officers still looked nervous. One of them muttered something to the other under his breath, something the man couldn't quite catch but understood by tone. He knew this wasn't going the right way. Years of experience had taught him to read a situation before it spiraled. So he tried again, his voice firm but respectful. He told them there was no threat here, that he could put the leash back on and they could talk peacefully. The dog sat patiently beside him, tail low, showing no sign of aggression. The officers exchanged glances. One seemed to relax, but the other remained stiff. The man could almost see the anxiety running through his body. He wished he could somehow make him understand that not everything needed to end in fear, that not every raised voice or movement meant danger. He clipped the leash back on and stood quietly. The officers asked for identification. He handed it over without hesitation. They didn't notice the quiet details. The name that had once been whispered in military circles. The rank that carried more respect than they could imagine. To them, he was just another man in a hoodie standing with a large dog. After a few moments, they handed his ID back. One of them muttered something like, "Just be careful next time," and they walked away. The man exhaled slowly, then crouched beside his dog. He rubbed behind its ear and whispered, "Good job, buddy." The dog looked up at him, eyes soft and trusting. That was the thing about dogs. They didn't see color, rank, or fear. They saw love and loyalty. They walked home quietly that day. The man didn't feel angry, just tired. He had seen fear in men before, but it always hurt to see it turn against something innocent. That night he sat on his porch again, thinking about how strange the world could be. A man could give everything, his strength, his courage, his loyalty, and still be judged by what people saw on the surface. But he refused to let bitterness take over. He had fought enough battles to know that peace was a choice. His dog rested beside him, breathing softly. The crickets sang in the distance, and the wind carried the faint smell of rain again. The man leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and tried to believe that tomorrow would be just another quiet day. He didn't know that the next morning would change everything. The next morning began just like any other. The air was cool and fresh, and a thin mist covered the fields near the park. He stood at the porch, sipping his coffee, watching the sky slowly turn gold. His dog was already sitting by the gate, waiting for their walk. It was calm, wagging its tail, ready for another quiet morning together. He smiled softly, placed the mug on the railing, and tied the leash. The gate creaked open, and they stepped onto the empty street. The town was peaceful at that hour. A few cars passed, and somewhere far away someone was mowing a lawn. It felt like the kind of morning when nothing could go wrong. As they reached the park, the mist had lifted. The grass was still wet, glistening under the sunlight. The man and his dog walked their usual route, stopping near a row of benches where they often sat to rest. The dog sniffed around happily while he watched the trees sway in the gentle breeze. He liked mornings like this. There was something healing about them. Something that made him forget the noise of the past, the orders, the shouts, and the fear that once filled his life. The calmness of nature gave him space to breathe again. His dog seemed to feel the same way, always alert but relaxed, always close by. After a while, they started heading back. As they walked past the park's edge, a group of kids ran by, laughing and shouting. The dog wagged its tail, watching them curiously. One of the kids dropped a small red ball that rolled toward the path. The dog barked once, a short, playful sound, and the man smiled. He could see how much joy that simple sound carried. By the time they reached home, he felt lighter. He poured a bowl of water for the dog, then sat down to eat breakfast. It was another simple day, or so it seemed. But sometimes the smallest things, the ones that don't even feel important, are what start a chain of moments that can change everything. Later that afternoon, while he was working in his small backyard, he noticed a police car drive slowly past the house. It didn't stop, just rolled by, but something about it felt off. He paused for a second, wiping sweat from his forehead. Maybe it was nothing, he thought. He had done nothing wrong. Still, old instincts made him alert. He watched as the car disappeared around the corner. A few minutes later, his neighbor, an older woman who often brought over cookies, came walking by. She waved, then leaned on the fence to talk. She mentioned that the police had been driving around the park earlier that morning, asking a few questions about a large black dog. The man frowned, confused. His dog had been calm, friendly. He couldn't imagine what anyone would have complained about. The neighbor shrugged and said it was probably just a misunderstanding. He smiled and thanked her, but a quiet unease had started to settle in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was that same old awareness that never really left him, even after years away from the field. He went inside, sat on the couch, and looked at his dog, sleeping peacefully near the window. The sun had moved lower in the sky, and warm light filled the room. For a long time he just sat there, thinking about how fragile peace could be. He told himself not to worry, not to overthink. Still, something in the back of his mind whispered that the world had a strange way of testing people when they least expected it. That evening, he decided to go for a short walk before sunset. The park was quieter now. Only a few people were there. An elderly man feeding birds, a couple sitting by the pond, and a jogger on the far side of the path. Everything seemed normal. He took the same trail, slow and steady. His dog trotted beside him, leash loose, tail swinging gently. A breeze blew through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth. He thought about how grateful he was for the life he had now. He had seen places where peace was impossible, where every step meant risk. Here he had a chance to live simply, quietly, without looking over his shoulder. But life, he knew, had a way of surprising even the most careful man. As they neared the park's exit, he heard distant sirens. At first, he didn't pay attention. Sirens were common in any town. But they grew louder, closer. He turned slightly, noticing a pair of police vehicles pulling into the far side of the park. The cars stopped abruptly and several officers stepped out. They looked around, speaking quickly into their radios. He frowned, not thinking for a second that it had anything to do with him. He started walking home, keeping his pace slow. The dog walked close, sensing his quiet unease. A moment later, one of the officers looked up, pointed toward him, and started walking in his direction. He stopped. His first instinct was calm. He wasn't a man who panicked easily. He had dealt with far more dangerous situations than this. When the officers approached, he greeted them politely, asking if there was a problem. One of them said they had received another complaint about a dog matching his pet's description, that it had scared someone earlier that week. He explained softly that his dog had never harmed anyone, that it was trained and always under control. He even offered to show the identification tag on the collar. Most of the officers seemed fine, just following procedure. But one of them appeared tense, restless. The man noticed it immediately. The nervous hands, the way his eyes darted toward the dog instead of him. He had seen that kind of tension before in men who were unsure of themselves. It could turn harmless situations into something worse. He stayed calm, his voice steady and low. He explained that there had been a misunderstanding at the park days ago, but everything was fine afterward. The officers exchanged looks. One of them stepped back to make a call on his radio. The man could feel the dog's muscles tighten slightly, sensing the rising energy. He gently patted its head, whispering reassurance. The dog's tail lowered, but it stayed still. Minutes passed. It was becoming awkward. People walking by started to notice, slowing down to watch. The man didn't like that. Attention always made situations more unpredictable. He told the officers he was happy to bring the dog home or provide documents if needed. One of the senior officers nodded, saying that might be best. The tension began to ease. The man was just about to turn back toward his house when another car arrived, a different unit that hadn't heard the full story yet. Two new officers stepped out, already on edge, responding to what they thought was a dangerous call. They saw the man, saw the large dog, and immediately assumed the worst. One of them raised his voice, shouting a command from across the park. The man lifted his hand slowly, calm and non-threatening, trying to explain, but things were happening too fast. The first group of officers tried to wave them down, but the new arrivals were already moving forward. The man could sense the fear, the miscommunication, the way everything was spiraling. He spoke clearly, his voice firm but controlled. He said there was no threat here, that they were mistaken, that everything was fine. His dog stood beside him, alert but quiet. For a moment, time felt heavy, the kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks. Then one of the officers, misreading the situation, took a step too close. The dog instinctively stepped forward, not aggressively, just protectively, placing itself between its owner and the stranger. The man reached down, hand on the leash, trying to steady the animal. Everything froze. He could feel the tension in the air, like the world had stopped breathing. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell them to wait, to give him 1 second. But the noise around him blurred. He could see the fear in the eyes across from him, a fear that had nothing to do with reality. He took a slow breath, doing what he had done countless times before, controlling the moment, reading every movement, every sound. But no amount of discipline could stop what came next. The moment passed, and then silence, a silence heavier than anything he'd felt in years. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He just knelt down, one hand on the ground, the other trembling slightly as his mind tried to understand what had happened. The world around him faded, the people, the noise, the confusion. He couldn't hear the officers' words, couldn't process the looks on their faces. He only saw the place where everything had changed. The park that had once been a peaceful retreat now felt empty and cold. Minutes later, more vehicles arrived. The scene filled with flashing lights, voices, and chaos. But the man stayed silent. He didn't yell or argue. He didn't even look up when someone tried to speak to him. His world had gone completely still. Someone finally helped him stand. They asked questions, but he couldn't answer. His throat felt dry, his mind blank. The officers realized the weight of what had happened, that they had made a terrible mistake. Some tried to explain, others stood frozen, unable to find words. The man said nothing. He simply looked toward the quiet spot where moments ago there had been life and joy. He stood there until the sun began to fade, casting long shadows across the grass. The people who had gathered whispered among themselves, unsure what to say. The police radio crackled, the sounds distant and meaningless. The man's face stayed calm, but his eyes carried the kind of pain only someone who has lost too much can understand. That evening, the town grew quiet again. The news spread quickly. An accident, they said, a misunderstanding. But for the man, it wasn't just a story. It was his reality, one that would never be the same again. He sat on his porch long after the world went dark, hands clasped, eyes distant. The silence around him felt different now, heavier, deeper. He had faced countless battles, but none like this. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and disbelief, something old stirred. Not anger, but resolve. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He only knew that this time the world would hear the truth about what peace truly meant. The night was long and silent. The town that had always seemed peaceful now felt like it was holding its breath. Inside the small house, every sound felt louder than usual. The ticking of the clock, the rustle of curtains moving with the wind, even the creak of the floorboards when he walked from one room to another. He couldn't sit still. His thoughts were scattered, heavy, tangled in disbelief. He sat by the window for hours, staring into the empty street where his dog used to wait for him every morning. The leash still hung near the door untouched. It was strange how one simple object could suddenly carry so much meaning. That leash had been a symbol of friendship, routine, and peace. Now it felt like a reminder of how quickly life could change. He wasn't angry. Not yet. What he felt was something quieter, deeper. It was grief mixed with confusion. He had seen people lose everything in seconds before. He had seen chaos, fear, and loss in ways most couldn't imagine. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was supposed to be home. All night he replayed the moment in his head. The voices, the panic, the sound that shouldn't have happened. It all kept looping like a broken film reel. Every time he thought about it, his chest grew tighter. He kept asking himself if there was something he could have done differently. He had spent a lifetime training himself to stay calm in the worst situations. Yet, even with all that control, he couldn't stop what had happened. By morning, exhaustion had settled over him. He didn't sleep at all. He sat on the porch as the sky turned pale, watching the sunrise. The birds were singing just like any other day, but the sound only made the emptiness inside him feel louder. A few cars passed by, slowing for a moment as if the drivers weren't sure whether to stop or not. Everyone in the neighborhood had heard what happened. They didn't know the details, but they knew enough to whisper. He didn't care what they thought. For him, nothing anyone said could change what was gone. Around mid-morning, a black SUV pulled up quietly near his house. A man stepped out, dressed in a suit but wearing no tie. He wasn't from the local police, though that much was clear right away. The man moved with confidence, like someone who was used to being in charge but didn't want to show it too openly. He approached slowly and introduced himself as part of an internal review team. He spoke softly, respectfully, explaining that the department was conducting an investigation into the incident. They needed his statement, he said. The man didn't answer immediately. He just looked at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded once and opened the gate, inviting him inside. The conversation was calm, almost too calm. The investigator asked about what happened step by step. The man described everything exactly as it occurred, no emotion, no anger, just truth. His voice was steady, each word measured. He wasn't trying to convince anyone. He didn't need to. The truth didn't require decoration. When it was over, the investigator closed his notebook slowly. He hesitated before speaking again. He said quietly that the department was deeply sorry, that no one had expected things to escalate like that. He said there would be accountability, but the man had heard words like that before in different forms in different countries. Words of apology always came after damage was done. The investigator left soon after, leaving a business card on the table. The house fell silent again. The man picked up the card, stared at it for a second, then set it aside. Later that day, he went for a walk, alone this time. He took the same path he used to take with his dog. The park was empty except for a few children playing far away. He stopped at the spot where everything had happened. The grass still carried faint marks from the chaos of that day. He stood there quietly, looking down, remembering how full of life that moment had been before it turned empty. He crouched, ran his hand across the grass, and whispered something too soft for anyone to hear. A promise, maybe, or a goodbye. Then he stood up, took a deep breath, and walked away. Over the next few days, messages began to come in. Some from neighbors, some from people who had served with him long ago. Word had spread, not because he told anyone, but because someone else did. People started to realize who he really was. They learned that the quiet man at the corner house wasn't just anyone. He had been one of the country's most skilled Delta Force commanders, a man who had led missions most people would never hear about, who had served with honor and precision, who had risked his life more times than anyone could count. News outlets picked up the story. "War hero's dog killed in police mishap," one headline said. Another called it a tragic case of misjudgment. The more the story spread, the more people wanted to know who he was, what he thought, how he felt. But he didn't say a word. He stayed away from cameras, away from reporters. He didn't want fame. He didn't want sympathy. What he wanted was respect, not just for himself, but for the life that had been taken without reason. Days turned into weeks. The officers involved were placed under review. their actions questioned by the public. Social media was flooded with debates and opinions. Some defended the officers, saying they were only doing their job. Others demanded justice, arguing that fear was not an excuse for carelessness. Through it all, the man remained silent. He spent most of his time in the backyard working on small repairs, fixing the fence, planting a few flowers. It was his way of staying grounded. He didn't talk to many people, but those who did see him noticed something different in his eyes. Not bitterness, but quiet strength. One afternoon, he received a letter in the mail. It was from an old commander, someone who had once served under his leadership. The letter was handwritten, full of respect and empathy. It reminded him of who he was, a man who had once taught others how to stay calm under fire, how to protect life even when surrounded by death. The letter ended with one simple line: "The world still needs your voice." He read that line several times, letting it sink in. It was true. He had spent years protecting others, fighting for justice and discipline. Now maybe it was time to stand up for those values again, but in a different way. That night, he sat at his desk and began writing. Not an angry letter, not a complaint, but a statement of truth. He wrote about what peace really meant, about how fear could cloud judgment, about the importance of compassion and control. He didn't mention himself or his past rank. He wrote as a man, not as a soldier. When he finished, he read it twice, then sent it to a local journalist who had written about the incident. A few days later, his words appeared in an article titled, "A Soldier's Reflection on Peace." The tone of the article was calm, thoughtful, and powerful. It wasn't about blame. It was about humanity. People across the country read it. Some cried, others felt inspired. His message spread far beyond the small town. Veterans wrote to thank him for speaking when they couldn't. Pet owners reached out with stories of their own losses. Even some officers wrote quietly to say they agreed, that fear needed to be replaced with understanding. For the first time in weeks, the man felt a small sense of peace. His words had turned pain into purpose. He didn't want revenge. He wanted change. One evening as the sun went down, he went back to the park again. The air was warm, the sky painted with streaks of orange and pink. He sat on the same bench where he used to sit every morning. The wind brushed against his face, and for a moment, he felt his dog's presence beside him. That same quiet comfort, that same steady loyalty. He closed his eyes and smiled faintly. He knew the road ahead would still be long. There would be hearings, reports, maybe even court cases, but none of that mattered as much as the message he had already shared. He had shown the world that peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from courage, from choosing dignity even when the world tries to take it away. As he stood to leave, a little girl nearby ran past him with her puppy chasing after her. The sound made him smile again. It reminded him that life, no matter how much it hurts, always finds a way to keep moving. He walked home slowly, the sun setting behind him, casting a long shadow across the path. The town was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. Something had changed, not just in him, but in the people who now saw him differently. That night, he looked up at the stars and whispered softly, "We're still moving forward." He knew tomorrow would bring more questions, more decisions, maybe even more pain. But he also knew something far more important, that true strength isn't found in anger or revenge. It's found in patience, in love, and in the choice to keep believing in peace, even after it's been broken. The news about what happened spread faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, it was on every local channel, every social media platform, and even national outlets started to pick it up. At first, the headlines were short and vague. Man loses dog in police encounter. But as more details came out, the story took a turn that no one saw coming. The quiet man in the suburbs, the one people thought was just another neighbor trying to live a peaceful life, turned out to be one of the nation's top Delta Force commanders, a man whose record of service stretched across continents and years of sacrifice. When people learned that, the silence turned into anger, then disbelief. How could someone who had given so much to his country, who had faced real danger and led countless men through life and death missions, be treated so carelessly by the very people sworn to protect? The man himself didn't speak to the press right away. He stayed home for a few days, keeping his head down, still trying to process the loss. His house felt empty without the soft steps of his dog following him around. Every corner reminded him of what he'd lost. The leash still hung by the door, The food bowl was half full, and the blanket in the living room still carried the faint smell of the animal that had been his closest friend. He didn't cry much, but grief showed in small ways. He moved slower. His eyes carried a distant look, and his hands, steady hands that had once handled missions with precision, trembled when he reached for things. When the police department issued its first public statement, it was short and defensive. They said the incident was unfortunate, but insisted the officers acted within procedure. The words sounded empty to those who knew what really happened. The man read the statement once quietly, then set it aside. 2 days later, a retired general who had once served alongside him reached out. He said he'd seen the news and couldn't believe it. The general asked if he was okay, offered to speak on his behalf, and even arranged a few interviews with veteran organizations. The man refused at first. He wasn't after fame or pity, but deep down he knew the truth needed to be told. Not for his sake, but because what happened revealed something much larger. By the weekend, cameras lined up near his neighborhood. Reporters wanted a glimpse of the silent hero, as they called him. They wanted a quote, a photo, a reaction, but he stayed inside, sitting by the window, drinking tea, looking out at the trees. For him, this wasn't about making noise. It was about dignity. When he finally agreed to speak, it wasn't at a press conference. It was in a quiet interview with a local journalist he trusted. The journalist came to his home, sat across from him in the living room, and simply listened. He spoke slowly, his tone calm but firm. He described what happened that day, not with anger but with truth. He talked about his dog, how he'd trained it, how loyal it was, how it had helped him heal after years of carrying the weight of memories from battlefields. He explained that when the officers arrived, he tried to remain respectful, tried to de-escalate, but they didn't see him as a person. They saw a threat. "I've faced men with weapons before," he said quietly. "I've stood in places where fear ruled everything. But I never imagined I'd feel that kind of fear standing on my own street in my own country." The journalist's eyes welled up as he listened. The story was no longer just about a man and his dog. It was about how easily misunderstanding and bias could turn something peaceful into tragedy. When the interview aired, it touched millions. People across the country sent messages of support. Veterans called him a brother. Families thanked him for speaking up. And even some officers from other departments admitted that something needed to change. The police department tried to contain the growing outrage. They placed the officers involved on administrative leave, but the public demanded more. Petitions started online calling for justice and accountability. Community leaders held candlelight vigils at the park where it all happened. People brought flowers, photos of their pets, and handwritten notes. One sign read, "He fought for our freedom and we took his peace." The man visited the park one evening quietly, without telling anyone. He stood there for a long time, looking at the spot where everything had changed. The setting sun painted the sky in soft gold and orange hues. He crouched down, placed a small dog tag on the ground, and whispered something under his breath, words only he and his lost companion would understand. Later that week, he received an invitation from a major news channel to appear live. They wanted him to tell his story nationwide. He hesitated but accepted. Not for fame, but because he knew silence could be mistaken for acceptance. When he appeared on screen, he wore a simple black shirt. No medals, no uniform. Just a man speaking from the heart. The anchor asked him what he wanted people to learn from this. He paused before answering. "I want people to remember that behind every uniform, behind every badge, and behind every label, there's a human being," he said. "Fear makes us blind. Judgment makes us careless. But understanding, that's what keeps us safe." The interview went viral within hours. People quoted his words online, and even those who had once disagreed began to listen. It wasn't about division anymore. It was about reflection. Days turned into weeks, and the official investigation finally began. The department was under heavy scrutiny. Independent experts reviewed the body camera footage, and what they found only strengthened the case. The dog had not attacked. It had simply stepped forward, curious, protective, but not dangerous. During the review, one of the younger officers who had been there that day came to visit him. Nervous and remorseful, the young man stood on his porch, eyes full of regret. "I can't change what happened," he said quietly, "but I need you to know, I'm sorry. I didn't realize who you were, but even if I had, it shouldn't have mattered. We failed you. The man didn't respond right away. He looked at the young officer for a long moment before saying, "It's not about me. It's about what you do next. Learn from it, be better. That's how you honor what's been lost." The officer nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. That brief exchange spoke louder than any press release. As weeks passed, the man started receiving letters, hundreds of them. Some came from families who had lost pets to similar misunderstandings. Others from officers thanking him for showing grace instead of anger. One letter stood out. It came from a child, written in shaky handwriting. "I'm sorry about your dog. My dad is a police officer, and I told him to be kind to dogs now." He smiled faintly reading it. That small note reminded him why speaking out mattered. Change often started in quiet ways, through small hearts learning compassion. The military community also stepped in. They honored him publicly, not for his past missions, but for his restraint and character in the face of injustice. "Leadership isn't about power," a retired general said at the ceremony. "It's about integrity, and this man has shown more courage in peace than most do in war." Through all this, the man remained humble. He didn't seek fame or pity. His focus stayed on awareness, on the lessons people could learn from what had happened. He began attending local meetings, speaking about empathy, community trust, and respect for humans and animals alike. His calm, steady voice carried weight. People listened because he spoke from lived experience, not from anger. Slowly, the narrative shifted. The story that began as a tragedy became a movement for understanding. The police department announced new training programs focused on de-escalation and animal handling. Officers began learning how to recognize situations that didn't require fear or force. He watched from the sidelines as progress took shape. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Change, he knew, was never instant. It grew like a seed, slow, quiet, and steady. One morning he woke early and went for a walk through the same park. The air was cool and the grass shimmered with dew. He carried a small wooden box under his arm. Inside it was a tag and a collar, the only things left of his companion. He reached the oak tree near the spot and dug a small hole, placing the box inside. Then he stood up, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Rest now." As he looked up, a small breeze passed through the trees, and for a moment he felt a sense of peace. Not complete, but enough. He realized then that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about freeing himself from the weight of pain. Later that day, as he sat by his window watching the sunset, he received a call. The department had concluded its investigation. The officers involved were dismissed, and the chief personally apologized. It didn't bring back what was lost, but it brought closure. That evening he stepped outside, the golden light bathing the quiet street. The world felt still again. Not the same, but calmer. He whispered to himself, "Maybe now we can all start to heal." He turned and walked back inside, closing the door gently behind him. The days that followed the conclusion of the investigation were quieter than any he had experienced in months. The news coverage slowly receded, replaced by other stories. But the impact of what had happened lingered in the town, in the hearts of the people who had watched and listened, and in the man himself. He moved through his life with a calmness that had not been there before. Not because the pain had vanished, but because he had learned to carry it differently, to let it shape him rather than break him. He spent mornings walking through the park, now empty of chaos, carrying only a small notebook and a pen. He would sit on the same bench where his dog had once chased balls and played with children. He wrote about what he had learned, about patience, about understanding, about how the smallest moments could hold the most meaning. He wrote for himself at first, not for anyone else, capturing thoughts that had never been spoken aloud. The first words in his notebook were simple. Peace is fragile. Respect is stronger than fear. Love is the truest courage. Those sentences stayed with him as he wrote about the things people rarely think about. How quickly misjudgment could escalate. How easily fear could blind, and how much strength it took to respond with dignity rather than anger. He often thought about his dog, not with bitterness, not with sorrow, but with a quiet reverence. That animal had been his anchor, his companion in silence, the one who had understood him without needing words. He imagined the dog running through fields of light, free from danger, playful and happy. He smiled faintly at the thought, feeling both the sting of absence and the warmth of memory. Neighbors began to notice a change in him. He was the same quiet man, polite and reserved, but there was a deeper presence about him now. People would wave from across the street and he would nod, sometimes offering a small smile. Children still ran past him, laughing, and sometimes he would watch them from the porch, thinking about the lessons he wanted the next generation to learn. One afternoon, a young family approached him. The father introduced himself as a local officer, a new recruit, and said he had read the man's statement and interview from months ago. The father explained that the stories had changed the way the department trained its officers, teaching them how to handle fear without letting it take control. "I just wanted to say thank you," the officer said quietly. "Your words, they've made a difference. We're learning. I'm learning." The man looked at him, seeing honesty in the young officer's eyes. He nodded slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Remember," he said, "courage is not in the gun or the badge. Courage is in control, in restraint, and in understanding what truly matters. Don't forget that." The officer left, and the man felt a quiet satisfaction. Change often started small in ways unseen. Sometimes it took only a single voice to ripple outward and touch many lives. Evenings became his favorite time again. He would sit on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. The air smelled of earth and flowers, carrying the memory of countless mornings he had spent with his dog. He would close his eyes and imagine that familiar presence beside him, reminding him that he had survived, that he was still capable of peace and still capable of love. Letters continued to arrive, mostly from strangers who had read his words or seen his interviews. Some were stories of their own pets, of how they had been inspired to train them with patience rather than fear. Others were from veterans, grateful that he had shared his perspective on courage and restraint. Each letter reminded him that life, even in its pain, could create connections that transcended grief. On one particularly calm evening, he walked to the park again. The grass was still wet from a light rain and the scent of pine drifted in the air. He reached the oak tree near the spot where everything had changed, placed a small bouquet of flowers, and knelt quietly. He whispered softly, "I hope you know how much you mattered. I hope you know you taught me courage in a way no one else could." It wasn't a farewell. He didn't believe that memories ended with loss. He believed that love, loyalty, and courage lived on, carried forward in the way people acted, in the way they treated others, and in the choices they made every day. He stayed there for a long time, letting the breeze and the quiet of the park fill the space around him. As he stood, he noticed a child running past with a small puppy. The dog tumbled in the grass, barking joyfully, and for a moment he saw a reflection of his own companion in that tiny, energetic animal. He smiled. Life moved forward, carrying lessons and light even after darkness. Back at home, he began spending more time helping the community, not in a loud or obvious way, but quietly as he always had. He would fix fences, volunteer at the animal shelter, and speak to local groups about empathy and understanding. His story had given him a platform, but he used it gently, guiding others without forcing his voice upon them. A few months later, the city council recognized his contributions publicly. They honored him not just for his military service, but for the example he had set in the wake of tragedy. He accepted the recognition with humility. He didn't want applause or attention. He wanted people to understand the value of restraint, compassion, and calm in moments that could easily spiral into chaos. Despite the recognition, he remained humble. Fame had never interested him, and it never would. He lived each day simply, appreciating the small things, the morning coffee, the sound of birds, the laughter of children, and the quiet strength of people who chose kindness over fear. One evening, a reporter asked him if he ever regretted speaking out. He paused, looking out at the fading light before answering softly, "Regret is wasted energy. I did what I believed was right. The outcome isn't perfect, but the lesson is. That is enough." Over time, the park returned to normal. People jogged, kids played, and dogs ran freely. The spot where the incident had occurred became a quiet reminder that even in tragedy, change could grow. A small plaque was placed there by the community, honoring not only the lost companion but also the lessons learned from the event. He often visited the spot, not out of sorrow, but to reflect. He would stand quietly, close his eyes, and feel a sense of connection to the world around him. The breeze, the trees, the laughter of children, all of it reminded him that life, no matter how fragile, was resilient. At home, he kept his routine. Mornings with coffee, evenings watching the sun, days spent helping others. Each day carried the weight of memory but also the hope of purpose. He had learned that peace was not a gift given. It was a choice made every day, and that choice, no matter how small, could inspire others to do the same. One night, while sitting on the porch, he heard distant sirens. But unlike before, the sound didn't make him tense. He had faced real danger, and he had learned that fear didn't have to control him. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs, and smiled. The world could be unpredictable, unfair, even cruel at times. But it could also be kind, full of small victories, quiet moments, and unexpected joy. He thought about the dog again, not with sorrow, not with anger, but with gratitude. That dog had been more than a companion. It had been a teacher, reminding him of loyalty, patience, and love. Those lessons lived on, not just in him, but in the way he carried himself every day. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm that was both ordinary and profound. The man found comfort in his small routines and purpose in his quiet acts of service. He didn't need recognition or fame. He had peace, and he had the knowledge that even in the darkest moments there was a way to respond with courage and dignity. He began mentoring young people in the neighborhood. Not formally, not in a classroom, but through example. He taught them the value of patience, the importance of understanding before acting, and the power of calm in stressful situations. They listened, fascinated by a man who seemed quiet and ordinary, yet whose life had carried extraordinary experiences. Occasionally, he would receive letters from veterans or civilians who had read his story. Some shared losses, others shared lessons they had learned from him. Each letter was a reminder that one person's choice to respond with respect and patience could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what they could see. On warm summer evenings, he would walk through the park alone, watching dogs play, children laugh, and families gather. He sometimes stopped near the oak tree, placing a small flower at the spot where the box of his dog rested. He would smile faintly, whispering softly, "Thank you for teaching me." He understood now that life didn't offer perfect endings. Loss was part of existence, and so was grief. But it was how one responded to loss that defined the strength of a person. He had chosen to respond with reflection, with dignity, and with the quiet courage that had guided him throughout his life. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, he walked home slowly. The sky glowed with shades of orange and violet, and the air smelled of earth and grass. He felt the weight of the world, but also the calm of acceptance. For the first time in a long while, he believed that healing was possible, even after unimaginable loss. Life would continue, unpredictable and fragile, but it could also be filled with hope, understanding, and quiet strength. He reached his porch, sat down, and took a deep breath. He looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the night sky. The memory of his dog was no longer a wound but a guide, a lesson in loyalty, love, and the courage to face the world with calmness, even when it felt uncertain. He whispered one final time, not to anyone, not for anyone, but for himself and for the memory of his companion. We carry on. We keep moving. We live with honor. And with that, he closed his eyes, feeling at peace with the past, present, and future.